The first light over Asch was not much of a light at all, just a dull gray pushing against low Belgian clouds. The engineers had scraped Y-29 out of the woods only weeks earlier. Now the pierced steel planking of the runway lay under a skin of frost, each metal square coated in a thin white sheen. The cold made everything sound sharper. Boots on steel. A tool dropped on concrete. The cough of a generator starting somewhere down the line. The Mustangs waited in two neat rows along the edge of the strip, noses pointed into the wet winter wind. Their blue noses were muted in this light, paint damp and dark with condensation. Ground crew moved around them with practiced economy, checking caps on gun ports, tugging at drop tank shackles, wiping frost from canopies with rags that stiffened as soon as they touched the plexiglass. The air smelled of gasoline, exhaust, and the sour chimney smoke from nearby farmhouses. Major John C. Meyer climbed the ladder to his P-51D and paused, one gloved hand on the canopy rail. The Mustang's skin was cold through the leather. He had flown in bad weather before, over Germany, over the North Sea, in conditions that would have grounded peacetime pilots. But there was something about New Year's morning on a muddy Belgian landing ground that felt wrong, as if the sky itself was not finished yet. He glanced down the line of aircraft. 12 Mustangs, their codes painted in white on the fuselage sides, waited with their propellers still. Beyond them, at the far end of the field, thunderbolts from the 366th sat like heavy-shouldered animals, wings dusted with frost. A few were already warming up, propeller discs turning to faint gray circles. Someone shouted near the makeshift operations shack, a canvas tent over rough timber. The sound carried thin and clear. Meyer saw a runner trotting toward the line, shoulders hunched against the cold, a clipboard clamped under one arm. "Major, weather's just good enough. You're still leading the cover flight." Meyer nodded once. They had planned a routine patrol to watch over ground forces and the airfield itself. Nothing ambitious. The Germans, everyone said, were nearly done. Fuel shortages, lack of pilots, Allied fighters over every road and rail line. The enemy's air arm was supposed to be a shadow of its former self. He gave the crew chief a small motion with his hand. The man stepped up onto the wing, double-checked the safety pins on the canopy jettison, then slapped the fuselage twice and dropped down. The ladder went away. Meyer settled into the seat, the parachute pack pushing him forward until his chest touched the edge of the panel. Familiar. Tight. Right. He went through the checklist by habit more than thought. Fuel selector, mixture, prop, magnetos. His breath fogged briefly against the glass before he cracked the canopy open again. The starter whined, a thin, almost feeble sound in the cold. Then the engine caught with a heavy, uneven thud. One bank of cylinders, then the other. 12 exhaust stacks spat out thick white vapor, turning quickly to gray as the oil warmed. All along the line, blue-nosed Mustangs woke up, one after another. The air filled with the layered growl of merlins at idle, a low, continuous vibration that ran through the steel planking and into the bones. They taxied nose to tail along the edge of the strip. Out beyond the trees, the front was only a few dozen miles away, but the war might as well have been over another horizon. The Battle of the Bulge had spluttered and slowed. The sky had belonged to the Allies for weeks. Pilots talked about the war ending in months, not years. Ground crew planned what they'd do back home with the money they'd saved. Meyer eased his Mustang into position for takeoff. The strip at Y-29 was not long, just enough for fighters and the occasional light transport. Beyond the far end, the land fell away into a patchwork of fields and tree lines. He could feel the surface under his wheels, the tiny joint clicks of the PSP, the slight bump at the transition to the main runway. Over the radio, voices were flat but steady. Red flight run-up complete. Blue flight ready to go. He squinted up at the sky. The overcast hung low and dirty, but the base between cloud and ground had improved enough to fly. No contrails, no distant drone of engines. Just the sound here. Now, that was when someone in the control tent heard it first. Not the throb of American engines warming on the ground, but something behind that, a deeper murmur filtering through the overcast. A sound that did not belong to this airfield. Meyer heard it too, as a slight difference in tone. British and American radial engines had a texture he knew by heart. This was more crowded, a ragged mixture of notes, some higher, some lower, out of synchronization, as if a single storm were made of several overlapping fronts. "Ops, you getting anything on radar?" a voice asked over the field net. Static. Then, report from Corps says enemy air activity over the front. No plots close yet. The sound grew, not from one direction but from several. Ground crew stopped where they were, heads tilted. A Thunderbolt pilot halfway up his ladder froze with one foot in the stirrup, staring toward the eastern tree line. With the overcast hanging so low, the sky was a low ceiling inside a room, and something large was moving just above the boards. Meyer's hand closed over the throttle. The patrol had been scheduled for minutes from now, but the air was no longer a neutral medium. Every second on the ground was a second spent in the open, in line, on a known strip that could be seen and memorized from any reconnaissance photograph. "Control, this is Meyer. We're taking off, now." "Roger, Blue Leader. Clear for immediate takeoff." There were procedures for everything, but there were also mornings when procedure bent under the weight of circumstance. He pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin surged. The tail came up. The Mustangs chattered down the steel plates. The frost streaked past the canopy, then blurred, then vanished as the aircraft lifted free of the runway. As his wheels came up, he saw the others begin their takeoff runs, one Mustang after another, pulling themselves into the gray space just beneath the clouds. Off to the right, Thunderbolts circled lazily above the field, heavy radial engines muttering, pilots inside probably wondering why the air suddenly felt crowded. Only as he climbed through 200 feet did the horizon change. Dark specks appeared under the clouds, first a handful, then dozens, arranged in loose waves. The dots elongated as they came closer, wings and fuselages resolving out of the murk. Short-nosed, square-tipped shapes, Focke-Wulfs, Messerschmitts, a formation so large it seemed to drag the sky behind it. There were more enemy fighters in that slice of sky than most of the men on Y-29 had seen at one time in months. It was New Year's morning, and the Luftwaffe, supposedly exhausted, bled white, finished, was arriving over a front-line American strip in numbers that did not make sense. For a heartbeat, the field, the aircraft, and the people on it existed in an impossible balance. Mustangs accelerating on the steel, half a squadron still on the ground. Thunderbolts circling above. Pilots turning their heads toward the incoming swarm. German fighters dropping their noses to begin their firing runs on that narrow patch of earth that held so much Allied metal. 12 P-51s, mid-climb, hanging between ground and cloud, looked up into a sky filled with nearly an entire German wing. Then the impossible moment broke. One of the Focke-Wulfs loosed its first burst at the runway, white tracers slashing low along the frost-covered planking, and the airfield at Asch ceased being a place and became a target. Hundreds of miles to the east, before dawn had fully separated night from morning, the German pilots had gathered in low, smoky rooms lit by shaded bulbs. They had been woken early. Some had celebrated the turning of the year in mess halls, thick with cigarette smoke and thin beer. Others had gone to bed early, knowing that fuel and aircraft were too scarce for reckless indulgence. Now they stood in front of wall maps covered with wax pencil lines, their heavy flight jackets creaking when they shifted. The officer at the front of the room pointed with a stick. Arrows ran across the Low Countries, all converging on a dense scattering of small rectangles. "These are their airfields," he said. His tone was steady, almost matter-of-fact, but the words described something outsized. "They are crowded. Fighters wingtip to wingtip, bombers, transports. The enemy believes this is his secure rear area. He will be sleeping off his celebrations, his defenses relaxed. A few men smiled briefly, not with joy, but with a thin, brittle anticipation. Tonight the Führer's armies strike in the west, the officer continued. The Americans and English rely on their air forces to stop our advance. If we strike first, if we cut the legs from under their air power here, the stick tapped a cluster of airfield symbols. Our soldiers will move without those eyes and claws over their heads. This is a necessary blow. It is the chance to restore air parity, perhaps even superiority for a time. On the maps, the Allied airfields were simple shapes. The reality was more complicated, but the men in the room were not given complexity. They were given a story that the enemy's air power, which had pounded German cities and armored divisions, might be brought low with one sharp, hard strike. The plan had a name, Bodenplatte, like a structural piece under a house, something fundamental upon which other operations might rest. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 11 were told only what they needed: time of takeoff, route, altitude, target. They were not told that other units would be flying different routes at similar times. They were not told about friendly flak belts over V-weapon sites and coastal defenses. Secrecy was necessary, they were told. The plan depended on surprise. A young lieutenant in the second row shifted his weight and felt the map board's rough edge under his fingers. He had flown defense over the Reich in a Bf-109, chasing American bombers through contrails so thick they became weather of their own. His original staffel had lost so many pilots that he now wore a different unit badge on his shoulder. He thought of the stories that circulated: fuel rationing, cut flight training hours, instructors reassigned to combat and killed before their students could learn enough to replace them. But this morning's plan sounded like an offense again, not improvisation. Numbers were whispered. Hundreds of aircraft, nearly every operational fighter the Western Command could scrape together. A last major throw. Low level all the way, the officer said. Below the enemy radar. You will see their towers and their villages. Stay in formation. Your target is an American fighter base near Asch, code name Y-29. Intelligence photographs showed two types of single-engine fighters: Thunderbolts, Mustangs. You will catch them on the ground. You will destroy them on the ground. The low murmur in the room thickened. Men thought of aircraft burning on airstrips far from home, of photographs of Cologne and Hamburg after Allied raids. There was a symmetry here. We have endured this, they thought. Now we will inflict it. A hand went up. What about our flak? They are informed, the officer said too quickly. Flight paths have been coordinated. Your recognition signals are in your orders. Fire discipline has been stressed to all units. The lieutenant saw a small twitch at the corner of the man's mouth. There and gone. He thought of the night fighters he'd heard about, waved off by their own guns one night, and engaged as enemies the next, because someone had not passed along the latest passwords. But this was a major operation. It had to be organized. It had to be. They filed out into the cold. The air on their side of the front smelled different, of wet earth and coal and the acrid tang from synthetic fuel plants. The Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts waited in scattered dispersal points, camouflage nets draped over their wings, tires sunk into frozen ruts. Ground crew pulled the chocks as engines coughed to life. Flames licked from exhaust stubs, washed blue-white by the propeller slipstream, then settled to a steady orange glow at certain power settings. The lieutenant walked around his aircraft once, eyes running over leading edges, tire sidewalls, the joint where cowling met fuselage. His fingertips brushed the wing root, feeling the thin, cold aluminum that separated his boots from the ground. In the cockpit, the FW-190 smelled of oil and canvas and the faint metallic odor of cordite gone stale. He slid the canopy closed, the world outside narrowing to a rim of plexiglass and steel. As the formation taxied, He could see other aircraft at the edges of his vision, wingtips flickering in and out of view as they followed the leader. They took off into a sky still more night than day. The formation turned to the west, leveling off low enough that the tops of trees occasionally rose higher than their wings. Church steeples slid past at the edges of their vision, quick and disquieting. Villages flickered by, windows dark. On some roads, columns of vehicles moved without lights, only the glint of metal and the suggestion of shape against snow. The plan said they would stay below radar, that the enemy would not see them until it was too late. It also meant they were flying through their own defenses. The lieutenant saw the first muzzle flashes ahead and to the right, a quick necklace of light along a low hill. For a few seconds he assumed it was Allied fire, some forward battery loosing shells into the pre-dawn gloom. Then shell bursts shredded the air around them, black holes torn abruptly into the morning. One aircraft in the line ahead twitched, then cartwheeled into a line of trees, disintegrating in a brief, dirty flower of flame. The radio crackled with a half-shout that cut off mid-word. Someone yelled, "Our flak! Our flak!" The formation jinked as much as low altitude allowed. The leader pushed on. They had too far to go, and too little fuel to climb or detour. The lieutenant kept his eyes forward now, away from the burning patch of ground where a comrade's aircraft had come apart. If he looked, he might see more. The belief that the plan had been carefully coordinated thinned into a more fragile hope, that enough of them would make it to the target, and that the target would be as defenseless as promised. The rivers below widened. The smell of salt crept into the cold air. In the distance, low clouds formed a solid lid. Closer, short breaks let beams of gray light pierce down. A flare went off from the lead, a prearranged signal. They were crossing the front. No one responded with recognition fire. The enemy guns were strangely quiet. They angled north, then west, then south again, following the path laid out in those briefing rooms. Target, a small American strip carved out near a place called Asch. Objective, destroy fighters on the ground. Expected opposition. Minimal. He checked his ammunition counters, watched the numbers sit solid behind the glass. Full belts of 20 mil and 13 mil, enough to rake a line of parked aircraft and still have something left for anyone who survived takeoff. When the airfield finally appeared ahead, it did not look like much. A short runway, a few hard standings, clusters of tents, no broad network of taxiways, no hardened hangars. A temporary place like theirs, held together by mud and steel and effort. What he could not see from where he sat was the 12 Mustangs lifting off, wheels already tucking into their wells, pilots inside pivoting their heads toward the incoming formation. The last belief, that this field would be quiet, that their prey would be still and blind, was about to meet a different kind of reality. To an American infantryman in the Ardennes that winter, the P-51 Mustang might have seemed like a miracle of speed and reach. To an engineer or a production manager back in the States, it was the end product of a sequence of decisions, contracts, tooling, shipping, training, and feedback that ran from drafting boards through machine shops to muddy airstrips in Belgium. When the first Mustangs had arrived in Europe, they carried Allison engines that struggled at high altitude. The decision to fit them with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, built under license by Packard, had changed everything about their role. Suddenly, there was a fighter that could climb with the bombers, escort them deep into Germany, then drop its tanks and fight. By the winter of 1944-45, the 352nd Fighter Group had used that platform to exhaustion. Pilots wore out airplanes. Airplanes outlasted pilots. Hours in the cockpit built a kind of communion between man and machine that looked casual from the outside, but was anything but. Training regimes in the United States had been brutal in their volume rather than in their cruelty. Men were pushed through basic, primary, and advanced flying schools in a steady river. Each step washed away those unsuited for the next. There were no shortcuts in number of hours, not by design. The system could afford to send a pilot back to the barracks if he did not meet standards. It could afford to pour fuel and time into repeated takeoffs, landings, stalls, instrument approaches, night operations. The same could not be said on the other side of the lines. By late 1944, the 352nd's ground crews had their own discipline, one that depended on crates, arriving on time, on spare engines stacked in depots, on replacement tires manufactured in plants that would never see a German reconnaissance plane. They worked by light of hooded lamps and small fires, hands stiff in the cold, installing new spark plugs and changing oil that had crossed oceans in tankers without the men ever seeing the process that produced it. The result on this gray Belgian strip was 12 Mustangs, whose engines fired on command, whose guns had been bore-sighted patiently, whose fuel systems had been bled of vapor, whose control cables had been inspected and replaced as needed. Above and behind them lay an organization that understood how to move squadrons across continents. The 8th Air Force had learned from years of high-altitude war, routing formations around weather, placing fighters where they would intersect bomber streams at the right moment, diverting groups to emergency fields when fog and cloud closed primary bases. For the pilot climbing away from Y-29 that morning, that whole machinery was invisible. He felt only the shove in his back as the Merlin pulled the Mustang into the air, the way the stick grew lighter as the wheels came up, the faint tremor in the rudder as the prop wash curled around the tail. He had spent months learning what he could ask of this combination of airframe and engine, how far he could lean the mixture without starving cylinders, what manifold pressure he could hold in a climb before temperatures threatened to climb out of the green arc, how much G the wings would take before the controls lost their bite. He knew that at this lank, low winter altitude, a P-51 with its drop tank still slung under the wings was not the clean, fast thoroughbred of the high-altitude escort missions. The tanks added drag and weight. Getting rid of them was one of the first things any pilot thought about when a fight loomed. What no one had planned for in detail was the moment when 12 such aircraft, in various stages of takeoff and climb-out, would find themselves between their own airfield and an incoming wave of enemy fighters. Behind them, Thunderbolts from the 366th patrolled a lazy circle, guarding the field as they had many mornings. They were more heavily built, with radial engines that could soak up punishment, but they were not in position to block the first rush. They would join the fray in moments. The opening seconds would belong to whoever broke through fastest. On the German side, the plan had not included the possibility of opposition in the first minute. It had assumed a clear run-in, cross the front low, pop up slightly to find the field, then drop into firing passes along the runway edge. Some units carried light bombs. Others relied entirely on cannon and machine gun fire. The aim was to destroy aircraft on the ground, not engage in sustained dogfights. The construction of the operation, tight secrecy, minimal briefing, last-minute route assignments had been designed to deny the enemy foreknowledge. It also denied many of the participating pilots full understanding of the whole. The men of JG-11 knew their own route, their own target. They did not know that JG-1, JG-2, JG-3, JG-4, JG-6, JG-26, JG-27, JG-54, JG-77, and others were launching in similar strength toward other fields. They carried in their minds a picture of a localized raid, not a theater-wide arms stroke involving something like 1,000 aircraft briefed and more than 900 sent toward Allied bases. Wikipedia. Systems on both sides had been built, strained, and rebuilt over years. On one side, production lines had run under bombing, under shortages, under political interference. On the other, they had run under rationing and labor disputes, but not under direct physical attack. Training philosophies diverged. One forced men into combat earlier, with fewer hours to husband fuel. The other rotated experienced men back as instructors and poured resources into their students. At Y-29, The intersection of these systems narrowed to a single narrow strip of steel and frozen mud. Meyer shoved the throttles full forward, then reached for the selector to jettison his drop tanks. The lever snagged slightly in the cold. He yanked harder. The Mustang lurched, briefly lighter, as the tanks separated and spun away below, tumbling toward the fields outside the base perimeter. "Blue flight, tanks away, break into them," he said. The enemy fighters filled more and more of the windscreen. Some were still in neat line abreast form. Others had started to splay out, each pilot picking his own angle into the mess of aircraft and ground targets. The Mustangs, climbing into that oncoming wave, were suddenly not targets, but obstructions, tracers stitched through the space where the Thunderbolts had been circling. One P-47 rolled into a defensive turn, its bulk surprisingly agile at low altitude. Another dived, using weight and gravity to gain speed. The first Focke-Wulf Meyer saw clearly came in from his right, a dark cross on its wing glinting briefly when a slit of sunlight broke through the overcast. The German pilot was committed to his run. The line of his nose, the angle of his wings, all said runway and ground targets. Turning now would mean losing the energy of the dive, wasting the precious seconds he had to fire. Meyer pulled back and rolled right, bringing his guns to bear not on the belly of the aircraft, but along the line the German would have to cross. His thumb found the trigger switch. The Mustang's 650 caliber gun spoke at once, a steady vibration running along the wings, brass and links spewing back along the fuselage. The tracers seemed at first to miss, flicking past. Then the FW-1R-90 flew into them like a man into a hard rain. Pieces came off the wing root, a panel, a section of aileron. The nose pitched forward, then snapped sideways. The aircraft hit the ground in a shallow angle, disintegrating along the far side of the runway in a spray of earth and metal. There was no time to watch. A Bf-109 streaked past on his left, close enough that Meyer saw the oil streaks on its cowling. It fired at a line of parked aircraft near the trees, rounds walking across the ground, plowing fountains of mud and steel. Radio calls overlapped. Some were clear. Others were cut off by bursts of static or by the pilot's own breathing. "Two bandits on my tail. I've got one. He's overshooting." "Watch the field, you're too low." From above, the scene resembled a knot of ants disturbed at their hill, threads going in all directions. But inside each cockpit, the world had shrunk to the span of the windscreen and the arcs that other aircraft traced through it. The young lieutenant of JG-11 found himself higher than he had expected, his dive broken by the need to avoid a Mustang that had suddenly appeared where his mental plan had placed only ground and steel. He pulled up slightly, trying to reset, then saw a Thunderbolt below, climbing hard, nose pointing toward one of his comrades. Instinct overrode briefing. He rolled onto the American's tail and fired. His 20mm rounds struck the Thunderbolt's right wing, ripping away sections of skin and spar. The big fighter shuddered, but did not immediately fall apart. Its pilot rolled, perhaps more from the impact than from intention, and dived, trailing pieces. The lieutenant followed for a moment, driven by the urge to finish, then checked himself. The field. The plan. Fighters were supposed to be secondary today. He pulled back into the melee and saw to his left something that did not fit with the pre-raid promises. A line of Mustangs were not burning on the ground. They were airborne, turning into his formation with discipline and aggression that did not match the narrative of sleepy, hungover enemy pilots surprised at their breakfast tables. One P-51 crossed his nose, close enough that he saw the red center of the American star, and a moment later, his cockpit filled with the flicker of incoming tracers as that aircraft's wingman opened fire. He jerked the stick aft, feeling the weight of the G-force press him into his seat. The FW-190 responded, but not with the crisp eagerness of a trainer in clean air. The low altitude, the speed, the disorganized nature of the fight all worked against the neat geometries of the classroom. His eyes lost the Mustang in the clutter of shapes, smoke, and ground. Somewhere behind him, a voice yelled in his headphones. The words were German but blurred, full of static and breath. The meaning, carried in tone alone, was simple. We did not expect this. On the ground at Y-29, mechanics threw themselves into shallow ditches or under the nearest mass of metal when the first round struck the field. Men who had spent months turning bolts and checking plugs now watched aircraft they had tended erupt into flame or take off under fire. One crew chief saw his pilot's Mustang, wheels barely off the ground, streak under a descending Bf-109 and then stand on its wingtip to avoid a collision. The American aircraft climbed away, its tail wheel still unlocked, the pilot inside too occupied with staying alive to worry about checklists. Thunderbolts arrived in pairs and fours, dropping down from their patrol orbit. Their pilots had flown ground attack for months, used to handling their rugged machines at low level. They fell on the Germans with a methodical brutality, firing not in long, wasteful sprays, but in measured bursts at close range. In the first minutes, the carefully arranged German attack came apart into dozens of individual fights. Some Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts did manage to rake the field, destroying several parked aircraft and strafing fuel and ammo dumps. But the price for each successful firing run increased sharply as the minutes passed. Each pass meant re-entering a volume of air now defended not just by light flak, but by pilots who knew every rut and tree line around the strip. What had been sold as a one-sided execution shifted, subtly then decisively, into a battle of attrition the attackers could not afford. The lieutenant of JG-11 saw another FW-190 go in near the end of the runway, its wing shorn off by a concentrated burst of .50 caliber fire. He saw a Mustang trailing coolant, canopy jettisoned, the pilot's body outlined against the sky as he scrambled over the cockpit edge. He saw lines of tracers crossing in patterns that had no place in the neat diagrams of the briefing room. Fuel gauges on both sides crept downward. Cannon ammunition counters spun toward zero. The timing of withdrawal ceased to be a staff officer's question and became a personal one. Do I turn for home now and risk being attacked and retreat? Or do I make one more pass and risk not having enough fuel to cross the lines? When the German formation, or what was left of it, finally broke away from Y-29 and turned east, it did not do so in tight order. Small knots of aircraft headed home at varying altitudes, some smoking, some missing, each pilot inside doing his own arithmetic of distance, fuel, and luck. Behind them, the field at Asch was scarred and smoldering but operational. Some parked aircraft burned to their wing roots. Others had taken splinter and bullet damage that would keep ground crews busy for days. But enough had survived. Enough had risen in those first impossible seconds to turn what had been intended as a quick decapitation into a bloody stalemate that, measured against the broader campaign, was favorable only to one side. When Meyer rolled his Mustang back toward the field, the fight had thinned out into scattered trails of smoke and a few isolated dogfights dwindling toward the horizon. His fuel state was low. His trigger finger ached slightly. He could not yet count his own unit's losses. He could see only the strip and the knowledge that it was still there for him to land on. For staff officers on both sides, the story of that morning would soon reduce to numbers. Across Western Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Operation Bodenplatte had committed on the order of 1,000 German aircraft to attacks on some 17 Allied airfields. Of those briefed, something like 900 had actually taken off, threading their way through their own flak belts, across the front, and into the mazes of Allied defenses. Wikipedia. In the Allied after-action reports, the destruction was counted in rows of aircraft types and damage categories. At least 232 aircraft were initially listed as destroyed on the ground. Single-engine fighters, twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft, 4 engine bombers caught during servicing. Later research pushed that total higher, suggesting that around 290 Allied aircraft were destroyed and another 180 damaged. Including those shot down in the air, a rough working figure of 305 destroyed and 190 damaged became accepted. Wikipedia. Viewed in isolation, these were heavy losses for one day. Individual squadrons, especially those caught with their dispersal patterns tight and their defenses relaxed, felt the blow acutely. Pilots returned to find their personal aircraft blazing wrecks. Ground crew saw the machines they had babied across continents reduced to twisted spars in the snow. But Allied numbers did not exist in isolation. Behind every burned-out airframe lay a pipeline of replacements. Aircraft in transit from factories, machines in depots awaiting assignment, older types being pushed down the chain as newer variants arrived. Training squadrons continued to produce pilots with hundreds of hours in their logbooks. Maintenance schools delivered more men with the skills to keep engines running and guns firing. At the level of command that measured capabilities by the week and month rather than by the day, Bodenplatte's damage was serious, but not crippling. Within days, many units were back to near normal strength. Within weeks, the impact had blurred into the broader wear and tear of a winter campaign. On the German side, the accounting was harsher and less forgiving. Of the aircraft sent out that morning, historians tally roughly 271 fighters and a handful of bombers lost, and some 89 damaged. More devastating than the airframes were the crews. The Luftwaffe suffered at least 143 pilots killed or missing, 70 captured, and 21 wounded. Among them were 3 wing commanders, 5 group commanders, and 14 squadron leaders. The fragile lattice of experience and leadership that held combat units together. Wikipedia. These were not numbers that could be easily replenished. German fighter training had been compressed and hollowed out by fuel shortages and the demands of the front. New pilots arrived at operational units with a fraction of the flight hours their Allied counterparts possessed. Many were thrown into combat after minimal transition training on their frontline types. The loss of so many experienced leaders in a single day meant that these green men would have even fewer mentors to steady them. When one pulls back further, beyond the columns of aircraft and pilots, other figures assert themselves. Fuel production, especially high-octane aviation gasoline, had been hammered by Allied bombing. Synthetic plants struggled to meet even a portion of the demand. Storage depots were vulnerable. Each hour of flight time for a Luftwaffe pilot represented not just risk to his life, but an investment of scarce resources that could not be duplicated in scale. Engine production lines in Germany still turned, but under bombardment, under transportation disruptions, under labor constraints. Even when new engines and aircraft reached units, maintenance capacity lagged behind. Cannibalization became standard practice. Airframes that might have flown again in other circumstances were stripped to keep others operational. On the Allied side, the mathematics followed a different curve. American factories had reached a steady state of output that dwarfed pre-war expectations. Rail and shipping networks, though strained, remained intact. The training base kept feeding squadrons overseas. A pilot lost over Belgium might be replaced by another whose training had begun months earlier, far from the battlefield's immediate pressures. Operation Bodenplatte, judged purely at the level of short-term damage inflicted, achieved something. Hangars burned, aircraft were destroyed. In some places, temporary local air superiority might briefly have tilted back toward the German lines, but the underlying equations of fuel, production, training, and attrition did not bend in the direction the planners had hoped. In sacrificing so many skilled pilots to win a day's disruption, the Luftwaffe accelerated the decline of its own effective power. General Adolf Galland, who watched the arc of his Air Force's fortunes from early victories through grinding defense to ultimate collapse, later said of that morning, that they had sacrificed our last substance. Wikipedia. The words were not poetic. They were an engineer's grim assessment of inputs and outputs. The Luftwaffe had spent a portion of its remaining capital in a way that did not purchase enough in return. At Y-29, the mathematics played out on a smaller scale, but followed the same logic. The German unit that struck the strip lost nearly half of its attacking aircraft, and more than 20 pilots killed or captured. The American units defending the field suffered losses, but kept enough strength not only to remain operational, but to claim one of the most lopsided tactical air combats of the war in terms of kills claimed versus losses taken. Bravery existed on both sides that morning. Men flew into crossfires, pressed home attacks under heavy flak, took off under fire. But the systems behind them weighed that bravery differently. One could absorb it, record it, and replace the men and machines that did not return. The other, by January 1945, could not. Years later, when the steel planking at Y-29 had been taken up and the fields returned to farming, the place where the runway had been was just another strip of Belgian earth. Grass grew where oil drums had once stood. Children rode bicycles along tracks that had started as access roads for fuel trucks. For those who had been there, though, that narrow rectangle of ground never quite returned to ordinary dimensions. Some of the pilots of the 352nd went home, built lives in suburbs and small towns, took jobs in factories, airlines, and offices. Their war shrank behind them, not erased, but folded into quieter days. On certain anniversaries, or when the weather outside matched a particular gray, they remembered the sensation of wheels leaving steel at Y-29 with enemy tracers already reaching toward them. German survivors of JG-11 carried a different weight. Those who had made it back to their dispersal fields that day often returned to find empty hard standings where comrades' aircraft should have been. They landed, taxied in, shut down engines that might not have many more hours left in them, and watched ground crew who had known the missing men light cigarettes with hands that shook in the cold. After the war, some of those men spoke or wrote about Bodenplatte with a tone that mixed pride in what they had tried to do with bitterness at the way it had been conceived and ordered. They knew that their skills and lives had been thrown into an operation that, even if perfectly executed, could not have reversed the forces bearing down on their country. The legend of Y-29, as it came to be called in some accounts, was not just a story of 12 Mustangs facing down a wing of German fighters. It was a story about the late-war Luftwaffe colliding with a matured Allied air system. It was a story about the shrinking gap between myth and reality as the war ground toward its conclusion. Historians and enthusiasts would later reconstruct the details, the call signs, the clock times, the individual victories and losses. They would draw neat diagrams of the dogfights over the field, arrows and circles showing who turned where and when. They would count bullet holes and cross-check claims against wreck reports. For the men who had been in those cockpits, what often remained were impressions. The way frost looked on steel planking at dawn, the hollow bang of a drop tank separating under -G, the sudden knowledge that the sky over a quiet landing ground could fill with enemies in less time than it took to complete a radio call. In the broader canvas of the Second World War, Y-29 was a small square, a moment at the edge of a larger operation that itself sat inside the final movements of a vast conflict. Its lasting lesson was not that courage on one side outmatched courage on the other. Both existed. Its lesson was that courage, by January 1945, could not reorder the arithmetic of fuel, production, training, and time. The impossible moment at Asch, when 12 climbing Mustangs and a handful of circling Thunderbolts found themselves between a fragile strip and an approaching German wing, has stayed in memory because it showed, in compressed form, How a system that could put ready fighters into the air quickly under unexpected pressure would outlast one that could not. If one imagines that field now, as it might look on a cold winter morning in the present day, the ghosts are not loud. They stand in the quiet. A mechanic checking a wheel chock, a pilot pausing on a ladder, a young German officer squinting at a low horizon, trying to reconcile what he was told would be with what is. Above them, the sky is the same low, heavy gray. The difference lies beneath it, in what people had built, believed, and learned by the time those engines turned over and those wheels left that strip of steel. The war moved on after that day. Operations shifted, units redeployed. The front lines crept closer to Germany's own borders. But for those who study the air war, Y-29 and Bodenplatte remain a hinge. One of the last times the Luftwaffe was able to gather such force, and one of the clearest demonstrations that force, without a sustaining structure behind it, could no longer change the outcome. The final image is not of an explosion or a smoking crater. It is of a line of aircraft turning for home through a low, indifferent sky. Their formations ragged, their fuel gauges low, their pilots newly aware that whatever they had believed in the briefing rooms did not survive first contact with the arithmetic of the war they were actually fighting.